Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back. This is Dr. Cassandra Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. I am so happy to be with you here now in season 5 of Foodie Pharmacology. We've come a long way, baby. 5 seasons. So with 134 episodes and counting, I'm so pleased to continue to bring you the latest behind the science, the culture, and the pharmacology of our food. And you can also help us keep the show running with 2 very simple steps. Head over to Apple Podcasts and scroll down to the rating and review section. And with a simple click, you can give the show 5 stars and help us to reach an even bigger audience. Next, would you mind buying me a cup of coffee? Seriously, for the cost of a cup of coffee, you can make a big difference in helping us to cover the operational costs for Foodie Pharmacology. Just head over to buymeacoffee.com/foodiepharma. So, this week on the podcast, we're going to explore the intersection of history and culture on our dinner plates. And I'm posing a very simple question that may have a somewhat complex answer. Can the origins of a culture be found in the simplicity of a meal? And our guest today is Andreas Viestad, and he is just the right person to answer this question. In his latest book, he takes a deep look at the meaning behind a seemingly innocuous meal in Rome. Andreas is a Norwegian food writer, a restaurateur, and activist. His latest book is called Dinner in Rome, and I have it right here, A History of the World in One Meal, where he investigates how food has helped to shape history and who we are today. He's most known in the US for his longtime public television series, New Scandinavian Cooking, and as the writer of 2 cookbooks, one on Scandinavian food and one on spices, and as a Washington Post columnist. So thanks so much for coming on the show today, Andreas. It's really nice to meet you.
Thank you. It's great being here, Doctor. I won't refer to you as Cassandra. I'll just refer to you as Doctor because that's kind of like a family tradition. My wife is an archaeologist. She has a doctorate, and I normally just refer to her as Doctor. I say, well, I think now it's time for the doctor to do the dishes since I made the food.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, my husband doesn't get away with that with the dishes. But gosh, it's great to see you.
But who does the cooking then?
Yeah, you're right. He does the cooking and the dishes. The kids do the dishes sometimes. I have a good situation. Yeah.
So you do nothing except being a doctor. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
And I do cook sometimes. You know, you're a fan of Italian food, so you'll appreciate this. My husband will call my food alla Cassandrese, the Cassandra style Italian cooking. So, great. Well, let's dive into some of the topics in your book. I love the approach to the book. It's a very readable book. You have a great way of bringing people into a sense of place as you're enjoying this meal. And actually, I want to read one phrase from one little excerpt from the book because this resonated with me, and I think it'll help to frame our discussion for the listeners out there. And so this is your chapter on oil and on olive oil in particular. The taste of the fried artichoke has 2 levels. One is a specific and unique taste of the artichoke itself and the shock of sweetness it brings. The other is a flavor that gives you an immediate sense of where you are in the world. It's a taste that crops up everywhere, and yet it's the basis of everything, from the simplest salad to pasta, fish, and meat dishes, the taste of olive oil. I just thought that was a beautiful tribute to olive oil. And why don't we start there? Just tell us a little bit about what brought you to write a book like this, dissecting a meal and kind of getting into the wonder and beauty of each of the ingredients.
Well, can I first say something about the setting of the book? It's a restaurant in the middle of Rome, in Rome's Campo di Fiori. It's a very traditional restaurant called La Carbonara. It's been there for ages. They more or less serve the same menu now as they did like 50 or 100 years ago. And this is very much the traditional Roman restaurant. You can go in there and you don't really have to look at the menu. You know more or less what they have on the menu because they're all pretty similar. And I thought that using that like traditional meal as a starting point would be great to continue kind of a discussion that I've had with my wife for many, many years. As I told you, she's an archaeologist, and we go to Rome. It's one of our favorite places in the world. And then we'll walk around this city that is so filled with history, and she'll point at, you know, a piece of marble, broken marble somewhere, and she'll kind of use her method, that the stuff that she uses with her students to sort of build the house that was once there, and tell the story of the culture that was there and built this particular structure. And that's very much, in a way, the archaeological method. And then at one point your feet are sore, and you're kind of a bit tired of that never-ending history lesson that is Rome, and then you sit down at a restaurant with a glass of wine and some pasta, and you just enjoy. And then it's very easy to think that Rome and history has these like two different levels, that this, the monuments and the ruins and the streets, they have a tangible history, whereas the food is just about enjoyment. But I kind of wanted to make a statement about food and history, saying that food is so incredibly important and always has been important in our lives, our human lives, and it is a building block in history. So I thought I wanted to use this kind of method to analyze a meal as well. So I kind of started calling it culinary archaeology, just to annoy my wife, but it kind of the term kind of stuck, and that's what I'm doing. I'm eating a meal, and then I'm analyzing it, just in the same way as you would if it was like the ruins of a great palace. But the great joy about food is that whereas that palace, that it crumbled 2,000 years ago, and we can sort of marvel at the fact that it's still there and we can read something out of it, the food is new and fresh every time. It's a fantastic thing, and we have such an intimate relationship to it. So I think that is, I'm so glad you used that little excerpt on oil, because oil has these sort of two different levels, as all food does. It is what it does to your flavor, your palate, your experience, your enjoyment. But it also tells this story of where you are. The Mediterranean culture was very much built around olive oil.
Around olive oil, yeah.
And I come from the north. I come from Norway, the north of Europe, and traditionally we didn't have olive oil. Of course, today you can buy anything, but so olive oil versus butter was a big conflict in the 16th century, when there was Reformation. When the Catholic Church and the Protestant Lutheran churches split. One of the things that they had a discussion on was the use of the mandatory use of olive oil, and there was this German priest who said, hey, the papal church is forcing us to eat this rancid oil, because not all of the oil was, they didn't export the nicest oil, and there were taxes, so it was super expensive, and then it would oxidize on the way. So the olive oil that you had to eat because of the regulations around Lent and all the fast days, that was very, very unpopular. And they had this sort of leader in the fight for butter against olive oil, and that leader was Martin Luther. He had valid and important theological arguments, but he also had this bread and butter sales pitch to the general population. He said, if you join me, you can eat your butter.
You can eat your butter. Who'd have known, like the great butter versus oil war or conflict? That's amazing. Well, there is so much history in each of our ingredients, and when I think of Italian food, as I'm sure many people do, we immediately think of pasta. And in the book, you wrote that there is more history in a bowl of pasta than in the Colosseum. I
Hmm.
mean, that's an incredible statement. So, what is that based on? Like, how is there
Well,
more history in
in a
my
way,
pasta?
I sort of, when I wrote that sentence, I thought I had to like pull myself together and feel, I felt brave when I wrote it,
Hmm.
because it's like it goes against everything you've learned. But the more I went gone into it, the more I feel that that is really not an exaggeration at all. I mean, the
Hmm.
Colosseum is an incredible thing, but it's just a building, you know. You can tell
Hmm.
the story of Colosseum, you can write a book about it, you can write hundreds of books, but it's still just a building, and there were really important things happening there during the span of a couple of centuries. Yeah, so it's quite an important building. But if you think of the way pasta has filled our lives, you can track pasta and wheat back, to the founding of Italy. How did the Italians know that they were one nation when they were joined and unified by force in the 1860s? It was when that little, the macaroni, as they called it, from Naples spread and became the staple food more or less all over the country. So you can tell that story. You can tell the specific story of the world's best dish, pasta carbonara, and how it might not have originated in Rome, among the coal settlers, but maybe it was a consequence of American soldiers staying in Rome just after the Second World War. But you can also track it back even further if you study wheat in itself. Wheat
Hmm.
is really the foundation of Western civilization. Because if you go back, say, 13,000 years ago, uh, the humans living in what is today Europe were nomadic. They were hunters and gatherers, and it was just when they started realizing that this little grass had a little seed that was quite nutritious and gave off a good energy bus and could help create food security. And then they started gathering it and replanting it and tending to it. And then after a while, they didn't, roam around because they wanted to tend to their their crop. And then that was the foundation of building the first houses, the first villages. At one point, they had to write down, who's got this and that much grain in the communal, storage room, and how do we protect it? They started, collecting taxes. So you can track all of this back to wheat, which is basically what you find in a bowl of pasta. So if you
Hmm.
use this method, there's no limit to how deep you can go.
Yeah, it's like a forensic history of a food.
Hmm.
I mean, what's interesting to me is, as a food itself, I mean, pasta is so diverse. There's so many different shapes and a lot of rules about which pasta you should use with which condiments and and which ones are good for soups, which ones need to be with a tomato base, which ones go with vegetables. Um, and, I can tell from your writing, you really love pasta carbonara. So why don't we start with there? Can you explain to the audience what is pasta carbonara? Because maybe not everyone is familiar with it. And what's so very special about it in your experience?
Well, pasta carbonara is a dish, but it's also one of these sort of. It's almost like um, an eternal idea. It is, it's more than its components.
Mhm.
The ingredients in a traditional pasta carbonara are pasta, normally a sort of shortish pasta, but not always. Um, and then egg yolk, uh, and then pig jowl instead of bacon or pancetta.
Hmm.
It's made with guanciale, which is the cured pig jowl, and
Hmm.
then instead of Parmesan cheese, which is often used, it should originally be pecorino cheese, which is the sheep's milk cheese, the hard sheep's milk cheese, which is kind of like Parmesan, but it's got a little more funk. And then
Yeah.
just a little sprinkle of pepper. And allegedly, that was because it was typical food for these sort of coal sellers, and there would always be a little sprinkle of coal in the dish.
Hmm.
But I think it's so interesting because it is the best dish in the world, and I'm not saying this just as a food lover. I'm saying this as an expert. No, but then I think it's interesting because there's so many rules associated to it, and the Italians are like super strict. I found this list of do's and don'ts about carbonara, and I think the Academy of Italian food has published a list of the most plagiarized and misused foods, and carbonara is on the top of that list. There's this saying that if your boyfriend makes carbonara with garlic, break up. If your boyfriend makes carbonara with cream, break up. If your boyfriend makes carbonara with the bacon instead of guanciale, break up. If he makes pasta carbonara from a tin or a pre-made bag, get a restraining order.
That's great. Well, I'm in trouble because my husband made amazing carbonara this week, but it definitely was not. It was just bacon and a little bit of cream and with the egg. So I'll have to tell him he's breaking all the rules. It was delicious, but maybe not as delicious as it could be if we followed the
But
right
the
rules.
fun thing about, and one of the reasons why I love Italian food is that there are all these rules,
Hmm.
and first of all, Italians tend to sort of be very strict about these rules, but then you ask your next Italian, and their rules are just as strict, but they're not the same. So
Yeah.
I think that's pretty fun. But also, there's this little fun fact about carbonara that it was, for some reason, there's this like big compendium of all Roman dishes from like the mid 1930s, and there is no mention of pasta carbonara there.
Hmm.
But it just pops up after the Second World War. And then there's this hypothesis that just after Mussolini's regime fell and Americans occupied Italy for a while, then, of course, the country was flooded with American soldiers, and they had rations from home that were quite, generous compared to the
Hmm.
situation in Europe just after this devastating World War. And you had like solid Midwestern soldiers, Biff and Chad, and they entered Rome, and they found that the food that typical Romans ate was like innards and strange looking and tasting things. So instead of eating that, and instead of eating back home in their mass kitchens, they would bring some of their rations into Roman restaurants and say, "Can you make something out of this?" And so
Hmm.
maybe the first carbonara was made with, tinned cream and bacon and eggs from soldiers' rations, and then that the backstory afterwards was like, "Oh, this is very authentic." It's
Yeah. Authentic Italian. Well, I think every cuisine is influenced by different cultures, and it makes you wonder just how many different points in history you have those types of intersections where people are bringing brand new ingredients to the table and saying, "Okay, what?
mm.
How do you transform this in your style of cooking?" Yeah.
I think that our cultures are always in flux, and I think that the fun thing with Italian, the particularly fun thing about Italian cooking is that it seems so rooted. It's so much a carrier of identity. You know, if you ask a normal American what is American cooking, it's sometimes a little bit vague, you know, depending on where you're from, and it's certainly the same in many other European countries. But Italians, they are so strict about it. But still, if you analyze it a little bit, you can say, okay, the pasta probably came to the Italians from the Arabs, you know,
Hmm.
granted a long time ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, and then obviously the tomato and the aubergines and stuff like that. Those are imports from the Americas, you know. Um,
Yeah. There's a
so
great
they have
story
this.
behind that. Yeah, I mean, if
Mm,
you think about it, when you ask people about Italian food today, it's always, well, it's with the marinara, and that
mm,
didn't exist until, I mean, I think the records show maybe until around the, oh gosh, into the 1600s or very late 1500s that they began to experiment with tomatoes. They thought it was toxic. I mean,
yeah.
it looks like other toxic plants from that region. Um, but really
And
interesting to see how it's produced.
it was certainly not widely used until the 18th
Oh
century.
yeah,
There was probably
exactly.
someone who ate it. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I think, there's a tendency with all kinds of sort of culinary things, is that you think that the food that your mother made is how it always was, but she probably made it slightly different from her mother, and maybe her mother again made it very different from, you know,
Mhm.
you know, certainly with this sort of um, story that you've had in the United States of immigration, but also in the rest of the world of urbanization. You know, my great grandmother was a peasant, and my grandmother was she studied to be a nurse, and she lived in the city, and so she gave me a taste of some of the sort of rural food that she'd grown up with, but it must have been very different from the food she actually grew up with. She
Yeah.
bought it in a store.
Well, that's another big difference, I think, is access to ingredients. Is it something that you're able to access right off the vine, or something that's been shipped from a far distance or is not
Mm.
quite as fresh?
Mm.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about um, how you apply these techniques in gastronomy to really dissect a meal. And you picked Rome of all of the cities you write, you travel, you experience foods in different cultures. I guess, why start with Rome for this particular book?
I think it's partly because of the thing I mentioned, that I'd been there so much with my wife, and
Hmm.
kind of started seeing the city through her eyes as an archaeologist, and then uh, thought that we need to study the food and see it as just an
Hmm.
important part, or even more important, I think, than all the sort of the physical framework and the buildings and structures. But I also thought that this is a very much a universal story, and I I think I could have told it sitting in a restaurant basically anywhere in the world, but
Yeah.
I think also Rome has been such a center of our sort of, certainly Western, in the sense of European and American culture. The, you know, most, since it was the center of Christianity for such a long time. So regardless of whether you believe or not, or
Hmm.
it is just an important city that belongs to the world more than
Hmm.
just, if I could have told that story sitting in a restaurant in Pittsburgh,
Yeah.
or in Düsseldorf, or in my Oslo, but then people would ask, hey, what is it about, the specificity of I think the specificity of Rome kind of it belongs to you and me as well, even though we're not Romans.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's really nice. Well, one other thing I appreciate in your approach to the book was some of your scenes read almost as like a anthropological, like ethnography. And I'll point to the chapter on wine, as I thought it was very sweet. You talk about people go to a restaurant to enjoy their wine, and there you can enjoy your wine. And there was a moment when an elderly gentleman perhaps had a bit too much and kind of created a chain reaction with the stairs.
Mm.
Tell us a little bit about that experience of just kind of observing human behavior in these settings, and how you brought that into the book, into your storytelling.
Yeah, it made me think because it was kind of towards the end of my meal. La Carbonara is a restaurant, a two-level restaurant. So there's a
Mhm.
little dining room on the ground floor, and then there's a quite substantial one floor up, and it's typically sort of congregated by people who come, regulars. In
Mhm.
the tourist season there are lots of tourists, but most of the year it's just regulars, Romans. And
Mhm.
there was this elderly, very neatly dressed gentleman who walked down, and he just did that little extra step that you sometimes do if you have one
Mhm.
glass too many. And he kind of fell, and he leaned on another one who leant on a waiter, and a glass broke. It wasn't dramatic, it happens all the time,
Yeah.
but it was this little awkward moment when everyone in the restaurant looked at him for just a second, and everyone knew that everyone had the same thought: oh, old man is drunk. And I thought of this because it was such an embarrassing thing, and everyone who likes to have a glass of wine will know that sometimes you have one glass too many. But there was something about, I made this sort of a reflection of the fact that we had a full room of people. We all were drinking wine, except for, like, there were three kids, huh?
Yeah.
Um, and and everyone drinks wine for the same reason. Yeah, it's tasty, but it's also, you like it because it's a little bit intoxicating. But the
Mhm.
moment that he flipped over and he just had one glass too many, we were all kind of judgmental, whether we meant to be or not. We looked at
Mhm.
him and we thought, oh, he's drunk. And and then maybe we could reconsider and say, yeah, good for you, old man. You're having a nice meal. Uh, but then also, if you study the history of wine and alcohol, it's been so important in sort of recent human history, by which I mean the last 10,000 years. And this sort of, our quest for enjoyment and this little bus has been really important, and it's an important part of many religious rituals. You can see sort of shadows of it in your wafer and your glass of wine as a part of yeah, communion and stuff like that. Um, and certainly there are indications that maybe one of the reasons why people started growing grains and becoming sedentary was our wish to be together, but also to be bound together in this sort of slight intoxication. So there were these sort of intoxication ceremonies that we
Yeah.
can say, we have some of the same in today's restaurants and bars, even though it has evolved.
I like that idea of like dining, especially fine dining as ceremony, because there are rules and there are
Mm,
taboos.
mm,
And if one breaks a taboo, like you said, the whole restaurant turns to
mm.
look at you. So that's just it's really fascinating. That's great.
And I love wine, and I'm quite particular about my wines. So
Yeah.
this here is a really nice Chianti, if I can show, from a
Hmm.
from a great producer. I've had it stored in my cellar um, for quite a few years, and then it's but still, and I drink it because I think it is fantastic and it's great with food. But uh, then snobbish people like me, and maybe even you, can kind of look down on people who drink Plonk or who don't really appreciate the finer points. But still, it's also, it is worth noticing that, even though I pretend to be drinking it only because I appreciate its subtle flavor nuances, it also does have like 14.5% alcohol, and the difference between a cheap plonk wine and a well stored wine, this has been in my cellar for nearly 10 years, is in a way like the difference between flying coach and flying business class. Is a more enjoyable way, but you're actually getting to the same destination.
Oh, that's a great analogy. Yes. Well, and I know it's hard to go from whether you're drinking the fine wine or you're in business class to go back to the other. I know that lesson well. Well, we're getting close to wrapping up the show, and before we do, of course, I have to ask you, because you are a food expert with some incredible cooking skills. Can you walk us through a recipe that we might be able to follow to have a really nice meal, maybe inspired by your book? I'm a little bit hesitant to say, can you teach us how to make pasta carbonara? I don't know, but maybe you can walk us through that, or even a simpler recipe if you have one that you enjoy making.
No, I think that, sure. I think one of the things which is great with a great meal, especially if you're going to share it with
Hmm.
your with your loved ones, is you want to be present. You want to be there yourself.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
I work with restaurants. Obviously, in a restaurant, the point is that someone has to work really, really hard, and the other ones can enjoy it. But if you're making a meal for someone you love, a part of showing that love is to make something really tasty, but is also showing up. If you
Yeah.
don't show
Yeah.
up, you know.
Yeah.
So I like the Italian way of having the beginning of a meal. Maybe something cold. Maybe if it's in season, just some lovely vegetables or some
Hmm.
prosciutto or something like that. And then pasta carbonara is one of those. In Italy, they have pasta dishes like the primi, and you're not supposed to just eat primi. You're supposed to eat a generous but not an incredibly big portion of it. And it's
Hmm.
certainly with the pasta carbonara is really nice because it is a quite rich dish. So if you eat a decent amount, but not three servings,
Yeah.
um, and then end up with the like what I do in the meal, end up having as a secondo the some braised lamb ribs. It doesn't have
Mm.
to be lamb ribs, but the point is that if you're making it at home, you can just have a piece, a tough cut of meat. Lamb ribs is very typical Italian, and you can just cook it over, medium temperature for a long time, so it's completely kind of falls apart, and it doesn't need much seasoning because, a kind of fatty piece like lamb ribs, it can handle a bit of, you know, a, a certain amount of beating. You don't have to be
Mhm.
super precise. So just potatoes and lamb ribs and a squeeze of lemon, and then end with a lemon sorbet. But then the only thing you really have to concentrate on is making the pasta carbonara, and
Nice, because
and it's
everything else is either cold prepared or
yeah.
is kind of slow cooked kind of situation. Nice.
And then I can walk you through very, very quickly how I make my carbonara. It's basically
Okay.
uh, you fry the guanciale, small pieces of this cured pig jowl, or you can use pancetta, or um, you can even use bacon, and then say,
Mhm.
because I believe in the Alan Davidson hypothesis on the origins of but then of the carbonara. So you cook that in advance, so it's quite crispy, but not charred to death, and then you mix, and then you have say 1.5 egg yolks per person,
Mhm.
um, and you have that in a bowl together with the guanciale or pancetta and the rendered fat, and then you've got a general amount of grated pecorino or
Mm.
parmesan. I
Mm-hmm.
prefer pecorino. And then you cook the pasta, you drain it, but you just leave a little bit. You take a little bit of the cooking water as well, and then you mix that together with the egg and the egg mixture, the egg and guanciale and grated cheese. And if it turns a little bit dry, it can turn a little bit dry. Then you just add a little bit of the cooking water, and then you can have a family argument as to how much pepper you should have. And I think I've had like a few years. This is like the favorite dish, my kids' favorite dish, and when I make it, I use quite a lot of pepper. So in the beginning, they were like complaining, but still finishing it because they loved it. And now they love the fact that I use maybe technically too much pepper.
I really love this because this is a very deluxe meal when you think about it. When you have the antipasto, you have the cold vegetables, or really the only thing you're working at is boiling the pasta because you've already prepared the bacon or the guanciale or the pancetta fried. That's amazing. And then you have a very fancy meal at the end that you can
Yeah.
eat and enjoy with your family, with your loved ones.
Yeah.
That's great advice, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
turn up. I mean, that's the first advice I give, people, since everyone knows, everyone I know knows that I work with food. They have a tendency
Yeah.
to contact me if they've got an important meal I'm making. I'm going to propose to my girlfriend, or
Yeah.
I've made a fool out of myself and I'm trying to get it back in to.
Good graces.
But then my advice is always be there yourself. Make a plan, which because imagine how dreadful it is to be on a date if you're sitting alone at the table and you hear someone is scrambling with the pots and pans in another room. That's no fun.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's actually excellent advice. So, tell us, where can our listeners go to find more about this book, about Dinner in Rome, and your other books? Where can they go?
Well, you can find them in good bookstores.
Mhm.
I think that a couple of my previous books are Where Flavor is Born is out of print. You can still find it occasionally, and you can find it via Amazon, for instance. And Kitchen of Light is also available. I know because I bought a copy for a friend of my mother's who really wanted it. And then Dinner in Rome is just being published in the US as we speak. So I know it should be in store in good bookstores, and of course you can buy it online as well.
That's great. Great. And Andreas, do you have any plans for your next project you can share with us? Or I know you're busy with many different things. So I don't know if you have another book coming out soon that we should keep an eye out for, or.
Well, I do a lot of work also on I have a few restaurants, so I'm working on some important restaurant openings in my native Oslo. So one of them has an American link. I'm opening 3 restaurants in the
Wow.
former US Embassy, a landmark building in the middle of Oslo. So that's very exciting. And I'm also working as an activist. I'm the founder of a nonprofit, a culinary center for children, where we do educational programs, because we believe it's super important that when you grow up, you should not just, you shouldn't just be told that potato chips are not good for you and broccoli is good for you. You should really have something invested in making and loving the healthy food. So it is a project that is associated with the Edible Schoolyard Alice Waters project that I'm sure you know.
Wonderful.
And I've just sort of started looking at a new book project on the fantastic multitude of different foods that we could eat and that we used to
Oh,
eat. And now we have this sort of paradox that today we have the possibility of eating more than than any others, especially us. We're lucky we live in an affluent part of the world, and we can say, do you want to eat Thai or Mexican or Scandinavian or Italian? But still, as a species, we humans get 90% of our calories from 10 plants and 5 animals.
Wow.
And the reason why we became so incredibly successful originally was our unique ability to eat basically everything. We ate hundreds and thousands of things. So I want to celebrate that diversity and reflect on what we've done to it, and just see also, in these times when the world is changing, we have to relearn how to adapt, because that was our superpower originally.
Yeah, that's such an amazing point. And we talk a lot about that on the show, of the importance of biodiversity and understanding the history of edible foods, and seed banking and conserving biodiversity for the future of our food system. So that is a great topic, and we should talk again once that's out. Well, thanks so much, Andreas, for coming on the show. It was really great speaking with you.
Thank you for having me, Doctor.
Great. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. It's brought to you today, recorded on Restream. I want to send a big shout out of thanks to our producers for the show, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth of Co-Conspiracy Entertainment. And I also want to just give you a reminder, help us out, help us get this show out to a broader pool of listeners. You can do that by going to Apple Podcasts and clicking those 5 stars for us. And hey, if you really love the show, leave us a written review as well. And lastly, I could use some caffeine, so buy me a coffee. Go over to buymeacoffee.com and /foodie pharma. And for the price of a coffee, you can help us produce many more episodes for this season and beyond. So thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.